All right, it's 1:03, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we blocked out 2 hours for this. I don't think we'll take the full 2 hours, so you can rest assured that maybe this will go quicker than you thought. I am Sky David. I am the staff attorney here at NCCASA. I am joined today by Kathleen. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Kathleen Lockwood. I'm the policy director at NCCADV, and we'll talk a little bit more later about transitions in my role there.
Great, thank you. We're going to go through our joint legislative update. First, I'm going to talk about the election, where we are right now, and then our past biennium. The legislature here operates in 2-year bienniums. And so we're going to talk about what our goals were for the biennium, what we accomplished, and what we're looking forward to in 2021. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. So as you know, there was an election, and I should say that today is the day that they are canvassing votes in every county in North Carolina. If you have been on Twitter today, you know that the Chief Justice seat is hotly contested. Like every 2 or 3 minutes, it's updating and someone new is in the lead. So really that's the most watched race right now. What I should say about the General Assembly is that a lot of folks thought that one chamber would flip this election cycle, and they did not. We're pretty much the same. In the House, there's 69 Republicans and 51 Democrats. This last biennium, it was 65-55. And in the Senate, it is 28 Republicans and 22 Democrats. And last biennium, it was 29-21. So pretty much the same. There were some lost House races that were pretty key races folks were watching. Scott Brewer, who is a judge, Christy Clark in Mecklenburg County, Ray Russell, Joe Sam Queen, and Sydney Batch. Sydney Batch, I just want to note, is a pretty big loss for sexual assault, domestic violence survivors. She was one of the only people there who really understood both issues and could speak about them well. On the Republican side, Stephen Ross in Alamance County lost, and Perrin Jones in Pitt County lost. Over in the Senate, Harper Peterson in New Hanover County lost, and I should note that that was a rematch of the 2018 election of him and Senator Michael Lee, and it went to Harper Peterson in 2018, back to Michael Lee this year. And I think just this morning that race became outside of the margin for a recount, so Michael Lee did win. There are a couple open seats, and these are folks that did win, not lose. Andrea Salvador in Mecklenburg and Sarah Crawford in Wake. And then there was an open seat that Republicans gained, which is Lisa Stone Barnes. So what we're looking at for 2021, the House Democrats, they need 48 votes. That is to sustain a veto. So since there are 69 Republicans, they just need 3 Democrats to switch over if they're gonna override a veto or have a veto-proof majority. And over in the Senate, they need 20 votes. And so the Senate Republicans just need 2 votes to be able to withhold that supermajority. I should note here, both chambers can pretty easily hold a veto. Back when we had this meeting in 2019, we talked a lot about how the Senate could only flip one person and they would be able to override the governor. I should note that the governor vetoed tons of bills, and there wasn't one of those that was overridden by the General Assembly. So on 0 occasions did they do that. So if you're concerned about this, or you think only 2 votes, they have held with the governor. Sometimes some Democrats have strayed on the first vote, but if the governor vetoes something, the party has stuck together. That's just something to keep in mind. I'll pause there. Are there any questions about the makeup of the North Carolina General Assembly? So I'm just going to talk about NCCASA's legislative agenda from this last biennium. Our number one focus was an increase in rape crisis center funding. That's always going to be a focus. That's just something that we would really like to see from the General Assembly. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The sexual assault evidence collection kit funding and policy guidance, withdrawal of consent, incapacitation, extension of statute of limitations for child sexual abuse, and then playing defense on detrimental bills. Those are kind of our 6 buckets of work that we really focused on during this last session. So for rape crisis center funding, just to note, we have been stable at $2.895 million since the recession in 2009. And I should state that we haven't been cut. We were cut then, and we have been stable funded since then. So we would just like to raise that back up to pre-recession levels. With funding comes the topic of CARES Act funding. So the CARES Act funding was advocated both by NCCASA and NCCADV, and it passed the first week of September, and it allocated $6 million for rape crisis centers and $6 million for DVSPs to spend on COVID-related needs. I'm going to pause here and just let Monica talk a little bit about that, because we are currently in the process of spending that money.
Yes, thank you, Sky, and thank you for also all of your advocacy to make this happen. I think by now, those of you who joined us on our CARES Act call heard the fierce work of Sky to make this happen. While felt like at the 12th hour, it was nevertheless a significant increase for sexual assault and domestic violence agencies. My job here is to remind you again and again and again that this funding has to be expended by December 30th, not 31st. And if you have questions, we are continuously holding calls at NCCASA, both office hours around the support of spending the money, but more importantly, we are still taking kind of stock of how you're doing on spending your money. If there are new requests for the money, currently Council for Women have given out a little over $10.5 million. So we still have over $1.5 million to expend. There should be a memo coming out from the Council for Women very soon. So I encourage you all, if you still have spending requests needed, to please advocate for yourself with the Council for Women on ensuring that we, one, give them the support they need and request to allocate the entire $12 million, and two, of course, to spend the entire $12 million by 12/30. Thanks, Sky. And of course, please feel free to drop any questions, thoughts, or comments around the CARE Act in the chat, and I'll respond to those appropriately. Thanks,
Monica. I just want to mention that we would really like to not have to revert any of this funding. That's going to help us when we advocate for more funding in next biennium, to say that we spent down this funding because our services were so needed and survivors really needed support. You gave us $6 million last year. We deserve some more on an annual operating flow. I think there might be a chat. How much was sent to each county? Monica, do you want to speak about that?
Sure. It actually depends on, so there is a breakdown on the Council for Women's website, but it actually depends on their request. So it was roughly a little over 95,000 per county for sexual assault, but the request was up to each agency. And so I don't actually have that breakdown, but it was up to the agency what they request. And I can certainly tell you that some agencies did not request the full $95,000 per county.
Great. And Carrie Ann says for DV standalones, it was 56,603.
And that was also per county.
All right. Moving on from that, and like Monica said, if you have questions about that, we have folks that are pretty much just solely doing CARES Act stuff right now. So send those our way. We are happy to discuss with you. If you're not sure if something qualifies as a CARES Act spend, just let us know. We'll talk through it with you and talk about that. Another priority of NCCASA during last biennium was the sexual assault evidence collection kits. So as most of you are aware, or maybe all of you are aware, in 2017, the General Assembly did an audit of all sexual assault evidence collection kits in the state, and we received that audit back, and there were 15,000 untested kits, which is the most of any state thus far. And after that, the DOJ got a SACI grant to fund testing of some of those kits. So in this legislative biennium, we asked for state appropriation to be able to test the rest of those kits. And we also asked for supplement policy guidelines to talk about what that would look like moving forward the process. And that was something we advocated for this year, along with the Attorney General's office. So with that being said, the Survivor Act did pass, and it provided $3 million in each year of the biennium to test the rape kit backlog. And it did require law enforcement agencies to submit the new rape kits to the state crime lab within 45 days, creates a review teams that are multidisciplinary, similar to a SART team. And law enforcement was in charge of assembling that team. And that has been in law since September of 2019. Another priority we had was the extension of the statute of limitations for civil child sexual assault cases. We did request an extension of this, and previous to last year, it was a 3-year period. So by the time someone was 21, the first bill that was introduced extended this to age 55, but then it came in a bill, which I'll talk about in a second. Another priority, I'm wrapping all of these up together because they were all in the same bill, was withdrawal of consent. As you know, NCCASA, this was really our top priority in the last couple bienniums. And every time we got really close to passing it, something would happen or a legislator would oppose it and it would kind of fall apart. So in 2019, we really went through the case law and tried to provide legislators with a few different options to make this happen. We were bound and determined. Another priority was incapacitation, and this came out of a 2008 Court of Appeals case that said victims of rape and sexual assault who are incapacitated due to voluntary alcohol consumption can't use that incapacitation for a second-degree rape. And it's because that language in the law said committed upon the victim. So if it was an act that the victim survivor committed upon themselves, they took the drugs themselves, they drank the alcohol themselves, that was not swept up into second-degree rape. So that was something we advocated for as well. And all of that came together into a bill, which was Senate Bill 199. And if you have been on any of my webinars, you know about Senate Bill 199. We talk about it a lot. It's probably the #1 question I get from either rape crisis centers or advocates, counselors, campus community, everyone, because it does a lot of different things, and a couple of them are kind of confusing. But it does allow that statute of limitations from 3 years to 10 years. So a survivor has until age 28 to bring a civil child sexual abuse claim. It also expands the duty to report child abuse, and that is what I would say we get the most questions about. If you have any questions about what that is or what you need to report, we have a whole YouTube about it, and you can watch that on our YouTube channel, or I'm happy to answer specific questions if you have hypotheticals, anything like that. It also required training for child sexual abuse and sex trafficking for school personnel. Also included in this bill was the right to revoke consent. So withdrawal of consent passed in this bill. We were the last state in the nation to allow you to have the right to revoke consent, but it was included in Senate Bill 199, and it was effective December 1st, 2019. Incapacitation, also included in this bill, also became effective December 1st, 2019. And if you have any questions, if you don't already have this handout from me, this is for mandatory reporting in Senate Bill 199, and it kind of walks you through the steps. If you would like me to send that to you, I am happy to do so. I see there might be some questions. Oh, yes, our YouTube channel. Thanks, Gabriella. Like I said, the effective date for all of that was December 1st, 2019. And we have been doing plenty of training around that, and we have been focusing on the mandatory reporting section. I will note that that's not something that was in our priorities at NCCASA, but it was part of the bill, and we have become content experts on it. So I am happy to talk about that. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk about some bills that we fought off. And one was a really bad campus bill, and it was called the Min Law regarding university discipline. It just popped up on our radar. We did not hear about it beforehand. And within a couple of days, we had to secure some promises from leadership that this wouldn't be heard. Due to that, it then turned into a new bill. And they took all the language out and put new language in, something we don't care about. And I should say that these do pop up annually. I expect to see some other campus bills this year, despite the new Title IX regs. This bill would have given accused students rights in campus sexual assault cases, and it'd give them more rights. Change the standard of proof to clear and convincing, which I should note is more restrictive than those Title IX regs. Ban expulsion for students accused of campus sexual assault off campus, so like fraternities or off-campus housing, and include that universities shall minimize the use of long-term suspension and expulsion, and ban mandatory suspensions or expulsions for specific violations. So it was just a bad bill. And so we at NCCASA made sure that we killed this bill right after we saw it. But again, I do expect to see something similar pop up. And again, it's more restrictive than Title IX regs that are currently in place. There was also a bill, House Bill 370, and it was required cooperation with ICE detainers. It received a ton of media attention. And I will note that NCCASA, NCCADV, and NCVAN, we all signed a joint letter on the chilling impact on victims reporting and presented that to House and Senate members. The governor vetoed it in August of last year. It did not come back up for a vote, and that is likely due to all of the concerns around the bill. So just to wrap up our stuff, looking ahead to the 2021-2022 legislative session, we will be surveying members to see what needs you are seeing and need to be addressed. I have that survey ready. I'm going to drop it in the chat, and we will send it out from NCCASA as well. But if you want to just fill it out now, we have that survey. Like I said, this is a similar makeup of the General Assembly. And I should note that our legislative agenda, despite an increase in Rape Crisis Center funding, although we did get CARES Act funding, was passed by this General Assembly, by a Republican-led General Assembly. And so we do expect that they're going to continue to do sexual assault work. The General Assembly, as it was made up this past biennium, was good to us. And so I expect for us to be able to be successful in continuing to advocate on behalf of survivors. If you have ideas about a legislative agenda, feel free to reach out to me directly. Like I said, I'll drop that legislative survey into the chat. It includes some like pre-filled things such as sexting, ending child marriage, but allows you to fill in the needs that you're already seeing. I just want to follow up and say that the General Assembly will return to Raleigh at the end of January 2021. They will be sworn in, and then we expect them to hit the ground running a few weeks after that. Usually they take a little break after their first day back. And we expect to kind of see what the budget looks like after April when tax returns come back. We are concerned, and this is something Monique and I have talked a lot about, that we're in a recession. And so our number one priority will be to make sure that we can protect our funding if needed. But if there is a surplus of funding, we will be asking for more funding for rape crisis centers. So that's something just to be aware of. I will be sending you emails about it. You'll hear from us on what's happening when the General Assembly returns. And I will drop that into the chat if you'd like to do the survey now. And I'll turn it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Sky. So similar to what Sky did, I'm going to go over just a recap of what we accomplished and tried to accomplish during the last legislative long session. And then I'm going to talk about some potential priorities for our legislative agenda starting in the 2021 long session. But similar to what Sky said, this is a growing and living legislative agenda, and I want you to be in communication with me so that this reflects what you see the changes really need to be in the coming year. Before I get into that, though, I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of the work in the recap is work that Sherry Honeycutt Everett, our former legal and policy director, can be credited with a lot of success in. She recently had to step away from her work at the coalition, but we have been in close communication and will continue to be in close communication throughout this next year. So I didn't want there to be any confusion about where some of the credit is due and some of our successes over the last legislative agenda season. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is our 2019-2020 legislative agenda. We're going to go into a few of these pieces in more detail because they are definitely impacting the work on the ground at this point. And there are some pieces where we can pick up where we left off for this next legislative session. First is that we wanted to make sure that the Marsy's Law implementing legislation was survivor-centered. As a reminder, Marsy's Law was a constitutional amendment that was approved by the voters. And in the last legislative session, the legislature had to create the statutory language that really put that constitutional amendment into effect. So we worked a lot on that, and we're continuing to be in partnership with different groups and making sure that that is a reality, those rights afforded to victims under Marsy's Law. We also worked to enact some needed changes to 50B that we'll go into. And we continue to put firearms removal on our radar as something that we wanted to make sure that judges had full discretion to do when domestic violence protective orders are issued. So that's what that third point there is about regarding Stancil. And then we continue to work to keep domestic violence funding level and fight any decreases in funding from the state level. And as always, continue to provide defensive action on any bills that had unintended consequences for survivors. So related to the Marsy's Law, like I said, we worked on that, implementing legislation to make that a reality. The major changes that we're going to get into those 50B changes for sure, Joanna, don't worry. So the major changes to the Marsy's Law implementing legislation were that in the crime victim Bill of Rights that was already in North Carolina state law, a lot of those definitions already covered survivors of domestic violence as victims in the criminal context, but Marsy's Law changed the definitions to be more expansive and included nearly 400 new crimes so that the victims of those crimes would also be covered by Marsy's Law and the rights contained therein. It also enumerated what those rights were. So there are 9 rights that were put in statutory language. And at the bottom, I remind you that we do have a quick guide on Marsy's Law. So if you don't have access to that and you have a lot more questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'll make sure that that gets emailed to you quickly to review. And then oh, if you could go back just a little bit. So with those non-enumerated rights, there was an enforcement procedure under state law for if those rights were not being afforded to victims. It allowed victims to say something and to potentially get those rights in reality throughout the criminal process. And it also, in addition to changing and expanding the definition of who victims were, it allowed victims of juvenile defendants to be covered under the crime victims' right bill. So it added a whole new set of victims in that way too. So just as a reminder, let us know if you would like access to the quick guide. And if there is an email coming out after this session, I will definitely make sure that quick guide is attached there for folks to see. Okay, we can go to the next one. So this is a recap related to the Stancil case and firearm removal that I mentioned earlier. So the way that state and federal law kind of work together with domestic violence protective orders is that under federal law, if someone has a domestic violence protective order issued against them, they're not allowed to possess or purchase a firearm. But it's really state law that dictates when that person is required to surrender any firearms currently in their possession to law enforcement for law enforcement safekeeping. And before this 2015 case, Stancil, a lot of judges were exercising discretion when telling defendants in DVPO cases that they had to surrender those firearms. There's specific factors in the 50B statute that are called high-risk factors, that when those factors are present, judges were encouraged to make a finding about the factor and require the surrender of firearms. But some judges were either not listing the factors or adding in kind of new factors when they felt like firearms needed to be surrendered. But that 2015 case said that that was not allowed, and judges really needed to stick to those high-risk factors, which we know are not always inclusive of all survivors that are at risk when there's a firearm in the home. So we worked in the last legislative session to see if we could restore that discretion in the statutory language, and we were not successful. The question that lingers from that is this an issue that's impacting the survivors that you're working with? Is this something that we should continue to push on our legislative agenda for the next year? So that's something to reflect on, and you're going to see my contact information a lot throughout this presentation since I am somewhat new to your faces. But please feel free to reach out to me if it is an issue, because survivor stories are always really impactful when we talk about legislative change. So the major changes to 50B that I mentioned really fall into three buckets. So one is that there was a new enforcement mechanism when defendants are ordered into a certified batterer intervention program in a 50B. Prior to this change, there was no mandated return hearing for a judge to make sure that the defendant actually completed that program, because unlike in a criminal case, when a 50B is issued, there's no kind of continued oversight of the court unless one of the parties makes a motion to bring the issue back into court. With this change under 50B, it required that when judges order a defendant to complete one of those programs, they also have to order a return date for the defendant to prove that they completed it. And the survivor does not have to come to that return date. And if the defendant is able to offer proof that they completed the program before that return date, folks don't have to go back to court at all. But it just added a little extra piece to put some accountability measures in place when these programs are ordered in 50Bs and not in the criminal context. Another change was that there was no clear and consistent idea of what time a domestic violence protective order expired based on the date on the front of the order. So for example, orders were saying it expires Friday, November 13th, and some counties, they were saying when the clock hits 12:01 a.m. on Friday the 13th, that order is expired, whereas others were going all the way to 11:59 p.m. and everything in between. So the statute was clarified to say that unless the time is listed next to that date, otherwise, when a date is listed on the front as the expiration, that protective order is going to expire at 11:59 on that date. And then the third one here, superseding orders, we're going to talk about a little bit more and looking forward to our legislative agenda for this year. But basically that change said that any subsequent court order after a 50B that had similar provisions to what was in that 50B would supersede the order, meaning that order would be in place instead. So we're going to get into the legislative priorities for 2021, but like I said, my contact information is going to be all over this presentation for you because I do want to hear what your thoughts are about what's currently on our priority list and what you want to be on our priority list moving forward. So hopefully through repetition, you'll memorize my email address at a minimum and reach out to me repeatedly. So like I said, the superseding orders language says that any subsequent court order issued after the DVPO will supersede similar provisions in a DVPO. That is what the change said. That is not exactly where our starting place was in the last legislative session in advocating for clarity about superseding orders. We really wanted to focus on later court orders in a family law case, so having to do with child custody or property division, just because we wanted it to be clear to the parties when they're going to court what changes could be made and what changes could not be made to a domestic violence protective order in another courtroom. That language kind of ended up being a little bit more expansive than what we had originally thought would be our goal. So we've asked you over the last year or so to look out for ways that this language is a problem and contact us. And please continue to do that because we do have partners that are interested in narrowing that language back down to make it clearer that the superseding orders really are only going to supersede provisions in a DVPO when they are in family law court. So things like eviction cases would not trump a DVPO or really any host of court action that's not a family law case. Another priority that will continue in this legislative session and has been in our legislative agenda for many years is to keep domestic violence funding level at a minimum, similar to what Skye said, static over the next session. We want your allocations to stay the same, despite the fact that we may be in a recession. And if it looks like legislators are wanting to decrease the allocation to domestic violence service providers, we're going to oppose those decreases. Also, like Skye said, it's really difficult to forecast exactly what our landscape looks like with state budgets right now. But regardless of what that is, your input is going to be really important. So similar to our advocacy around the CARES Act, we will be sending you a survey at some point to collect information about what your needs are so that we can use that granular and detailed level when we're talking to legislators about your needs for the budgets in the next legislative session. So once again, here is my contact information. Another priority for our next legislative session is to increase court access for survivors, particularly when we're looking at emergency court closures. This has always been something that has been in conversation with different partners because it always comes up during inclement weather. So if a courthouse is suddenly closed for ice and a survivor needs access to a domestic violence protective order right then, counties were varying in what the access was for the survivor in the moment. This has obviously become a much more expansive issue geographically and in occurrence because of COVID-19. So we've heard from y'all during the last 7 or 8 months that there may have been situations where your courthouse has been 100% closed because of a COVID exposure, and survivors will go to try to get a domestic violence protective order and be told to just go to a neighboring county for the next week or so. And that causes problems for you, for survivors, and for court officials. So we are interested in looking for ways to amend the 50B statute to require chief district court judges to designate a magistrate or an on-call judge during emergency court closures. And also those of you that may be in a jurisdiction that already has magistrate designations, we want to change the way that designation works. So the way 50B currently is written, if a chief district court judge allows a magistrate to hear DVPOs during court closures, that survivor or plaintiff still needs to come back to court the minute court reopens, which could be the next day, could be 2 days later, to ask for an additional ex parte. And their temporary ex parte relief is only going to extend for that 1 or 2 days. We want to look at the possibility of changing that for these emergency court closures so that the magistrate or the on-call judge can issue an ex parte just for the same length and with the same authority as a judge would be issuing it if it weren't for that emergency court closure. So once again, we'd love to hear from you about the ways that this is popping up in your county so that we can use those stories for this advocacy. And if there are other kind of changes or tweaks that you think would be helpful in this court access statutory change, please let me know. And then Sky mentioned it briefly, and I think it will be in their survey as well, but NCCADV is one of a number of organizations that have been partnering with national partners like Tahari to raise the age for marriage in North Carolina. The Council for Women also partnered to create a really helpful release of a study about child marriage and the status of that in North Carolina. With the way our laws currently are, North Carolina is tied with Alaska for the lowest marriage age. So the current state of the law in North Carolina is that 18 is the age for marriage. If you are 16 or 17, you can nonetheless get married with parental consent, which is really just signing off on a form. And if you are 14 or 15, you can only get married in North Carolina if you are pregnant and you have court kind of sign off on that. And there is a guardian ad litem appointed to children in that situation. But what this study found is that those lower ages and those exceptions really are happening in our state. And because we are one of the only states in the country with those exceptions, in some cases we become a destination for people to marry children in North Carolina, that those marriages would otherwise be statutory rape, or the sexual activities in those marriages would otherwise be statutory rape. So it probably goes without saying how that's related to domestic violence and sexual assault and all of these other issues in North Carolina, but we have some really great fact sheets if you'd like to learn more about that. Also, if you or the folks at your agencies have worked with survivors that are sharing stories of being into a forced marriage as a child, we would love to hear those, because we want this to be a survivor-led initiative, and we want survivor voices to be a part of the legislative change, because that is so impactful in having legislators really quickly and easily understand the dangers of this. And then lastly, this is another piece on our legislative agenda that will sound very familiar to many of you. North Carolina law for 50B still does not provide full access to 50B for same-sex dating partners. If someone's in a same-sex dating relationship, it does not count as a qualifying relationship. This has been challenged in North Carolina Court of Appeals, and we have been waiting for a very long time on a decision on that court case. But we are pretty confident that it will be seen as an unconstitutional law, and when it does, we expect some legislative movement to change that 50B requirement there. So, like I said, here's my contact information again. Reach out to me, let me know what you think about the priorities currently on our legislative agenda and what you want to see more of, and you will definitely be hearing from me regardless of whether you reach out first. So if there are any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat now. I will make sure that the quick guide on Marsy's law gets sent out to NCCASA so that it's in your follow-up email.
And I do believe that, yes, Gabriella shared in the chat our survey for 2021, 2022. If you have any ideas or you want to become more involved, we will be doing an advocacy webinar probably in early January. We are updating our advocacy toolkit right now. Once we have some feedback from folks across the state, we will add to our legislative agenda and include in the advocacy toolkit some one-pagers on each topic. The advocacy toolkit includes templates for letters, how to have meetings with elected officials, and it's local, state, and federal. So we're going to include our national priorities as well. Monica, do you want to talk about those federal priorities?
Sure. And we will, to Sky's point, we'll continue to send out those federal priorities and send you emails asking for your support. We had, I think, 5 congressional briefings this year, and we will continue on with those in the new year in 21. But I will certainly say the biggest one, as many of you know, will directly impact us, is the cuts that we are anticipating to VOCA. So all of the victim advocacy organizations at the federal level have been jointly advocating and sending out the very same similar letters to our members about what that impact will mean to direct services. So the first one is truly the advocacy around VOCA. And that's things like going back to reminding them that COVID is still hugely impacting the way that we do our work and the way that we provide services. And a cut to that will not benefit survivors or our services. We've also still been talking about match for VOCA, and then we've largely also been talking about the way that VOCA has been used for management cost. So really being very clear on VOCA being used for direct services primarily. The other is we still have not given up on the HEROES Act. So we just had a call that I'm not on right now on the HEROES Act and the continued advocacy at the federal level, which is a version of the CARES Act that provides direct services to sexual assault. So specifically for sexual assault, we've had an increase in sexual assault services program asked in the HEROES Act. And so we will continue to advocate on that. The biggest thing that we are starting to collect data on, and I had my first call with Department of Justice on, I think, Wednesday evening, and that is anticipated changes to the Violence Against Women Act. As we can imagine, the next administration will have that as a high priority. So the first meeting on the Violence Against Women Act and what we anticipate changes and what we want to present in the first 100 days to the new administration is Monday. So if you have thoughts about that, I'd be happy to get those from you now. Our first call is Monday at 12:30 to start talking about our anticipation of this administration addressing the Violence Against Women Act in the first 100 days. And for those of you that are rape prevention are funded by RPE, that of course is at the top of our list of sexual assault advocacy as well, is an increase in the rape prevention education funding, which is a part of the Violence Against Women Act. So those are kind of our top priorities now, specific for sexual assault, SASP, RPE, and the larger 20 plus programs within the Violence Against Women Act. And still doing a ton of Title IX work, but that will also be very different in the new administration as well, given that those are regulations. So we anticipate the work that we've done on Title IX reinvigorating that in the first 100 days as well.
We'll just open it up to questions. Kathleen and I are happy to answer any questions y'all may have. Carrie Ann is also on this call. I don't know if Carrie Ann would like to say anything as well.
The only thing I would like to say is that I'm grateful for Sherry's hard work, for Kathleen for stepping in this transition, and for the collaboration with NCCASA on so many issues. So we're just always grateful for that partnership. And thank you to all of you for joining in the advocacy efforts around the CARES funding as well.
I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. Like Kathleen and I both said, Gabriella, we will send out all of the resources that we have mentioned within like an hour of this call. We'll get that information out to y'all so that you have those resources to back up. And I would just say keep an eye out for those surveys from each of the coalitions. And if you are interested at all in being more engaged in policy and advocating, we will be providing some webinars on that. I'm happy to join you at any of your legislative meetings. And I'm happy to have a one-on-one discussion with folks if they want to engage with local officials or whomever that may look like for them. This was very quick. No one has questions.
Another plug for the survey, which Gabriella has put into the chat. So please, if you have not completed the legislative priorities survey for Sky, please do.
And I'll just close by saying thanks so much for having me today. And please remember my contact information and reach out because I do want this to feel very collaborative.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.